Week 14 of the fantasy football season, and his quarterback sits every matchup this week. The first game, Thursday Night Football, New England Patriots at the Pittsburgh Steelers. So we know both offenses, they've had trouble all season, and that with only two teams on bye in the Arizona Cardinals and the Washington Commanders. Bailey Zapp, he went out there, he tried versus the Los Angeles Chargers, but they lost 6-0 in Week 13. And this week versus a good Pittsburgh Steelers defense on Thursday night, going into Pittsburgh, I don't think Bailey Zapp's a guy anyone could really trust. He's a sit. Mitch Trubisky is a sit for me as well. We know Trubisky was a high-touted pick many seasons ago with the Bears, but he just hasn't panned out, and he's bounced around with the Buffalo Bills and the Steelers the last couple seasons as a backup. And this week, I know he has some decent weapons on the offense. Najee Harris, Warren in the backfield, Deontay Johnson, George Pickens, Pat Freiermuth. But this week versus the New England Patriots coming to town, I think this could be a low-scoring game and one of the sloppiest games we see on Thursday night. So Trubisky is a sit. Carolina Panthers at the New Orleans Saints. Bryce Young, it's been a tough rookie season, and a lot of people thinking he's a bust already. But to be honest, he don't really have a lot of weapons and a good supporting cast. But this week in New Orleans, I don't see him doing much. We know this New Orleans defense is middle of the pack unit, and they need to start winning games. Now to New Orleans, Derek Carr, he left that game with an arm injury and shoulder as well. We'll see if he's going to play. But even if he does play, Derek Carr is tough to trust. He's not getting that second touchdown. I know the passing yards have been there. He's got a nice number one wide receiver in Chris Olave, but the stats really haven't added up. And Carolina, believe it or not, they've been a decent defense versus quarterbacks this season. He's a sit. And if Jameis Winston starts in this game, he's a sit for me as well. We know Jameis, he has the big arm. He's a gunslinger, but he also turns over the football a whole lot as well. So both these quarterbacks sit, especially with the two teams only on bye. I don't see them cracking much of the top 15. Now to the Rams at the Baltimore Ravens. Matthew Stafford, the last 2 weeks, he's playing great football. He's finding the end zone. He's getting everyone involved. Puka Nacua, another big game. Cooper Kupp, Kyren Williams, great in the backfield this season. But this week, a tough matchup at the Baltimore Ravens, one of the better defenses in the league. So this week, Matthew Stafford's a borderline option. I'm not saying he can't go in there to Baltimore and have a nice ball game, but I really don't see it. It's a tough Baltimore defense coming off the bye week. And on the road this season, this Ram offense is totally different than it is at home. Lamar Jackson, he's a start each and every week. You know you're going to get some bad games out of Lamar, but with his running ability and just the touch he has this season, he's playing great football like this Raven team is, leading them possibly to a Super Bowl this season. He's a start. Indianapolis Colts at the Cincinnati Bengals. So Gardner Minshew having one of the best games of his career last week at the Tennessee Titans in the overtime victory. But this week, a tougher matchup versus at the Cincinnati Bengals. We know his Bengal defense, middle of the pack, has been hit or miss. Some weeks you can put points up on them, and some weeks they play a tight game. So I know that was a crazy Monday night game between the Cincinnati Bengals and the Jaguars. Up 31 points in that one was a Spangled defense. But right now, I think Gardner Minshew is still tough to trust in a Week 14 game, especially a lot of teams' playoff hopes are on the line here. And he's a sit. Jake Browning, what a game he had on Monday Night Football. No doubt about it. But obviously, we got to see a little bit more out of Jake Browning before I'm comfortable to put him in the starting lineup and a player that fantasy owners could use week in and week out. But Browning looked good. He had poise in the pocket. His team was down many times, a lot of lead changes in the game, but him and Jamar Chase had a good rapport. T. Higgins made a few plays, and Joe Mixon obviously was the focal point of the offense as well, scoring 2 touchdowns. But this week here versus Indianapolis, obviously another potential shootout I could see between these two teams. Browning, if you're in a desperation mode, isn't the worst start, but like I said, it was only one game, and I have to see a little bit more out of him. So he's a sit this week. The next game, Jacksonville Jaguars at the Cleveland Browns. Trevor Lawrence, if he plays in this one, which I highly doubt he does after hurting the ankle and getting folded up late in the ball game on Monday night in Week 13 versus Cincinnati Bengals. So Trevor Lawrence, he was starting to get things going over the last few weeks. After the beginning of the year, he pretty much was topping out anywhere from 15, 20 fantasy points. But like I said, 25-plus fantasy points a few weeks in a row. Big injury, obviously. We'll see what the official word is. But right now, it's a sprained ankle. And as of today, he's going for an MRI. If he does play somehow, he's not going to be 100%. And it is a tough matchup at the Browns. But, Week 14, crucial matchup where there's not a lot of quarterbacks available on the wire. And you can't make a trade. Somehow he does play in this game. I give Lawrence a start, and if C.J. Beathard's going to start, which most likely I believe he will, he's a sit for me. We haven't seen much out of Beathard throughout his career. He used to start for the 49ers a couple seasons ago, where he just came in towards the end of the year, and it was a bad season, but Beathard He's a quarterback that's been a journeyman throughout his career. Really not much throwing the football or playing a lot, especially over the last couple seasons, just being the backup for this Jaguar team. He's a sit. Now to the Browns, Joe Flacco's a sit for me. Joe Flacco, though, he looked pretty well in last week's ball game where he had poise in the pocket. He was getting the football down the field, and him and Elijah Moore were on the same page going back to their Jet days. But this week here in a matchup versus the Jacksonville defense, I know they do give up points, but they create turnovers as well. And Flacco, it's tough to trust him. He's 38 years old. He's not a mobile quarterback anymore where if you get a hand on him, obviously he's going to go down. So this week, even in a matchup where their secondary is beatable, he's a sit. And if Thompson Robinson returns in this game, he's a sit for me as well. We haven't seen much out of Thompson Robinson. I know the Browns have won a few ball games with him at quarterback, but this week in a tough matchup versus Jacksonville Jaguars, where they do have a good defensive line and could get to the quarterback, even though Jake Browning did light him up in last week's game. These quarterbacks are just tough to trust, and he's a sit. The Detroit Lions at the Chicago Bears, both these teams had a nice shootout a few weeks ago where the Bears, they were up 10 points with about 4 minutes left, but the Lions came back and won that game in Detroit. So now going to Chicago Soldier Field, Jared Goff, he's been playing good football for the majority of the season, coming off a huge game at the New Orleans Saints in Week 13. And this week here, we could see that mini shootout once again with both quarterbacks putting up good fantasy points. So Jared Goff, great weapons, St. Brown, Jameson Williams starting to get going, Montgomery Gibbs out of the backfield, and obviously Sam Laporta, who's in the Rookie of the Year conversation. So he's a start. Justin Fields, we know you're going to get ups and downs with Fields, but the potential and the game-breaking ability by Fields is tough to sit, especially in a matchup versus a line defense on the road where they give up a lot of points this season. So even with the struggles in his last game at Minnesota, he's a start. Tampa Bay Buccaneers at the Falcons, Baker Mayfield to start. Him and Mike Evans playing great football. Evans already cracking 1,000 yards on the season. And Rashad White, a great receiver out of the backfield as well. I know Chris Godwin hasn't done much this season. I know Cade Otton, he had the goose egg in last week's game. But right now, Baker Mayfield, he's playing confident. I know this Buck team, it's been a tough season, but Mayfield's at least going out there and putting in competitive performances and keeping the games close. He's a start. Out of the middle of the pack, Falcon defense, Desmond Ridder a sit for me. I think Ridder, one of the worst quarterbacks in all pro football. And this week, it's not a horrible matchup versus this Tampa Bay Buck team, but it's not a matchup obviously I'm going to be favoring as well. So this week, Desmond Ridder, in those circumstances, really, he's a quarterback I have interest in starting. Houston Texans at the New York Jets, C.J. Stroud, one of the better quarterbacks in the league. He obviously Rookie of the Year favorite is C.J. Stroud. And it was a tough loss last week to lose Tank Dell to out the game at once, and now Stroud's got to go back to the drawing board a little bit, see if another wideout could step up like a John Mechie, possibly Robert Woods, Noah Brown once again. But this week, even in a tough matchup of one of the better defenses in the league at the New York Jets, I got Stroud to start. And for the Jets, we don't know who's going to start 100%, but in my opinion, it doesn't matter. All these quarterbacks, Trevor Siemian, Tim Boyle, and Zach Wilson, all the same guys who can't put points on the board. Guys that are going to take sacks, and they're going to turn the football over as well, and they're behind the bad offensive line of the New York Jets. I think this Texan defense goes in to MetLife and has a big ball game. Seattle Seahawks at the 49ers, Geno Smith, easily his best game of the season last week, and a great game it was, but they just fell short in the fourth quarter, not keeping the lead versus the Dallas Cowboys. So Geno, we know he's got great weapons. DK Metcalf, finally that monster game. Tyler Lockett, Kenneth Walker possibly returning in this game with Zach Charbonnet. But this week at the San Francisco defense, that I think is one of the better units in the league. And we saw them pretty much hold Philly down in the second half of that Week 13 game. And now going to San Francisco, I can't start Geno in this one. Brock Purdy to start. Brock Purdy and this Niner team, they got off to the 5-0 start, then lost 3 in a row. And now ever since then, they've took off once again is this 49er team. And Brock Purdy playing great football. And when you got guys like Brandon Ayuk, Deebo Samuel, who finally looks healthy, and George Kittle in your passing game, and a good scheme run by Shanahan, you're going to have a great offense and a great output. So Brock Purdy, once again, is a start. Minnesota Vikings at the Vegas Raiders, Joshua Dobbs, I know he had one of the worst games on Monday night a few weeks ago versus the Chicago Bears, but this week a good matchup at the Raiders. He's picking up the playbook more coming off a bye, and usually we see guys get better with younger players or just new players on the team after a bye week. So I think Joshua Dobbs, after a horrible ball game and 4 interceptions. He goes out there at the Vegas Raiders and puts in a good performance, and you know you're going to get 4 or 5 points minimum weekly with his legs. Aiden O'Connell, he's a sit for me. O'Connell, he's been an all-right quarterback. He does move the football, but he's not really a guy for fantasy football. He's scoring anywhere from 12, 15 fantasy points on most week, and obviously that's not going to be enough to put up numbers and help fantasy owners win ball games. So this week, Aiden O'Connell, even in a decent matchup versus a Viking defense that really isn't that good, he's a sit. Buffalo Bills at the Chiefs, a rematch of the AFC Championship game a few seasons ago, where that was one of the classic games and the biggest scoring games you're going to see in the playoffs. Josh Allen, best quarterback in fantasy football this season in terms of fantasy points. I know turnovers are the problem, but this week at Kansas City in a must-win game for Buffalo, that's 6-6 on the year. He's going to have to go in there and make some plays and throw the ball all over the yard, and he's a start each and every week. Patrick Mahomes, this season, the elite numbers haven't been there where he's scoring 30-plus fantasy points weekly as Mahomes. He's still putting up points. I know this offense, in terms of receivers on the team, they're not really making plays besides Travis Kelce and Rashee Rice emerging over the last few weeks. But Patrick Mahomes, he's still going out there, 20, 25 fantasy points. And this Bill team decimated defensively with a lot of injuries. The Broncos at the Los Angeles Chargers, Russell Wilson, one of the better quarterbacks, believe it or not, this season in fantasy football. And in the fourth quarter, I know Wilson didn't have a great game at the Texans, but he still always finds a way to get you anywhere from 18, 20 fantasy points, and that's what he did in last week's game. We know this Charger defense can't stop anyone besides the Patriots last week, winning 6-0 in one of the sloppiest ball games you'll see. And this week here, indoor game at Los Angeles, I believe this could be a mini shootout, and Russell is a start, Justin Herbert a start for me as well. I know Herbert the last 2 weeks, the numbers have been poor, but this week in a matchup where they know they need these games is Los Angeles. And last week, coming off a bad performance, only scoring 8 fantasy points, I think Herbert in this offense gets back on track. They're not going to be in the rain. Indoor game, and he plays way better at home than he is on the road. Monday Night Football, Philadelphia Eagles at the Dallas Cowboys. So pretty much this is a ball game for first place in the NFC East. I know the Eagles 10-2 and the Cowboys 9-3, but both quarterbacks playing at a high level. Jalen Hurts, once again MVP candidate, possibly could win this season. And the Eagles coming off a blowout loss at home versus the Niners. I think Jalen Hurts and this offense gets back on track, and they're going to be motivated. And we even saw Seattle last week torch this Cowboy defense. Dak Prescott, last 5-6 weeks of the season, he's possibly been the best quarterback in fantasy football. It's hard to argue he hasn't been. Him and CeeDee Lamb on the same page. Him and Mike McCarthy, they just know what they're going to call and get the plays going. And when you got a quarterback that knows what the head coach wants and what plays are going to be called and where the football is going to go, that's a lethal combination of a guy who's locked in and making big plays. And when you got a number one wide receiver like CeeDee Lamb that can make all the plays, line up anywhere on the field, it makes it easier as well. And we know this Philly defense, believe it or not, they're one of the worst teams versus the pass in fantasy football. So Dak, a start once again. Monday Night Football, Green Bay Packers at the New York Giants. So Jordan Love, the last month of the season, him and this Packer team have really turned things around. And now Christian Watson is starting to get going. Hopefully Watson's all right and he can play in this game after pulling a hamstring on an end-around sweep at the end of that game and a great victory versus the Chiefs in Week 13. Romeo Doubs, he's been great this season. Jaden Reed. So they got weapons on the offense. Love makes plays extended as well with his legs to roll out and get the open man. And this week here versus a Giant defense that's been better over the last few weeks, but still vulnerable versus the pass. Love is a start. Tommy DeVito, he's taken the town by storm over there in New York, is DeVito. But right now, it's a tough matchup versus the Packers. We saw them limit Patrick Mahomes and that high-powered Chief offense for the most part. So Tommy DeVito still really don't have a number one wide receiver. And this week here versus a Packer defense getting healthy, what players coming back on Monday night. He's a sit, and another Monday night game and final game of the week, Tennessee Titans at the Miami Dolphins. So Will Levis, we know he has a big arm. We know he does play behind one of the worst offensive lines in the league. But Levis, he shows he's got a good arm, and he can make plays and extend them as well a little bit. But the fantasy points really haven't been there. So this week, in a ball game where they're most likely going to be trailing out of the gate 10, 14 points at Miami, and he's going to have to throw 35, 40 times. I still don't see him putting up enough production to be a quarterback to start, and he's a start each and every week. Him and Tyreek Hill, the most dangerous combination, in my opinion, in the league. Last week, that game was over early, hitting Hill quick in that game for a 78-yard touchdown, and then going back to him later in the game as well for a deep ball. So when you got guys like Tyreek Hill, Devon Achane out of the backfield who can make plays with his legs or break tackles, and Raheem Mostert and Jalen Waddle. This is just a lethal offense, and this week versus one of the worst defenses against the pass, Tua could have a top 3 performance. So the quarterback starts, sits every matchup for week 14 of the fantasy football season.